Good morning and welcome to the first ever One Voice, One Humanity, our UN International Day of Human Rights event. My name is Omar Dehen and I feel very privileged to be leading you for the next hour and the first half of this TEDx-style program. Today marks Human Rights Day, when the UN General Assembly in 1948 adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so on its 73rd anniversary, the New South Wales arm of the UN Association of Australia has created this platform to present our nation's most important promoters and advocates of human rights. This is an opportunity for you to hear the unique perspectives of change makers across a wide section of our society, from athletes, entrepreneurs, refugees, to human rights and justice advocates and politicians. These are people who aspire to make a real difference, a positive impact, and in the process, inspire others. Today's aim is to bring together these voices to help shed light on the complexities that surround human rights, raise awareness of those challenges, and also celebrate the important, meaningful achievements that also have been made. These universal rights are inherent to all of us, regardless of nationality, gender, ethnicity, color, religion, or any other status. These are rights that we must have simply because we exist as human beings. This event is being hosted by UNAA New South Wales in partnership with the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion at UTS, as well as Affinity Intercultural Foundation. We want to thank them all for making today possible. And again, thank you, our guests, for choosing to be here virtually with us. Another COVID variant might be in the air, but just as the last 2 years have shown, the resilience within our society of this renewed uncertainty, it's still ever present. And the fact that you have chosen to join us to hear these important stories and messages does mean something, and I really just wanted to acknowledge that. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the program, which is a series of short, meaningful talks interspersed with videos and music. We have 4 themes today: our common humanity, the impact of COVID on human rights, shaping the future of human rights, and human rights in sport. We will have a short break after the first 2. We will commence with the Acknowledgement of Country by Philippa McDermott, who's the Head of Indigenous Employment, Diversity and Inclusion at the ABC, Chairperson of Bangarra Dance Theatre, and Board Director of the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre. Then there's a speech from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, which was made on this year's UN Day. That will be followed by our first theme, our common humanity, and its speakers: Lorraine Finlay, Human Rights Commissioner from the Australian Human Rights Commission, Senator Dr. Mehreen Faruqi, the first Muslim woman in the Australian Parliament, Dean Parkin, Director at From the Heart, and that will be followed by a powerful animation, a story of strength, resilience, sovereignty, and power that has been told by the voices of First Nations women and girls. We will then close that round with a musical performance from Iranian refugee Sina Karimi. We hope you enjoy.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody, and Jingari, which is hello in my Yugambeh language. Thank you for having me here on this very special UN International Day of Human Rights and this event, One Voice and One Humanity. As Omar said, my name is Philippa McDermott, and I'm a proud Malanjali and Waka Waka woman, and I have been honoured to being asked to do the Acknowledgement of Country. I would like to acknowledge that I'm here today on the land of the Gadigal and Bidigal people at Gamay, Botany Bay, and I would like also to acknowledge that wherever you are today, you're on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. I pay my respects to elders past and present and those emerging leaders of our future, and I acknowledge their stories that teach and guide us. I also pay my respect to other Indigenous people here today and acknowledge your cultural authority from your lands and waterways. While we acknowledge our Indigenous elders, I would also like to pay my respects to all of our elders for their wisdom and love and lessons that they've taught us, because without them, we wouldn't be here today. A few of us here on the Zoom are blessed to live and work on this magnificent Gadigal country. And while this is not my family's traditional country, my country is Malanjali, which stretches from the Tweed River in the north of New South Wales through Mount Warning. Wollumbin is our sacred site, and up into Bow Desert southern Queensland. And Malanjali means scorched earth people because of our black volcanic soils of our mountains. That's my grandfather's country, and my grandmother's traditional country is Waka Waka country in central Queensland on the Burnett River. And the reason why Indigenous Australians always acknowledge where we are from and say what country we are from, because that helps define us. Firstly, acknowledging country is to pay respect to the elders whose lands we are on and acknowledge that they are the custodians of that land, and in turn, they allow us safe passage through their lands. But further to that, as Professor Mick Dodson explained, when we talk about traditional country, we mean something beyond the dictionary definition of the word. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we might mean homeland or tribal land or clan or an area that is much more than just a place on the map. For us, country is a word for all of our values, places, resources, stories, and cultural obligations associated with that area and its features. It describes the entirety of our ancestral domains and the laws of our dreaming. And while we may not have Western title to our land, we're still connected to that country and the country of our ancestors, and we consider ourselves the custodians or caretakers of that land. That's why it's important for us to explain where we're from, because with that custodianship comes responsibility, law, and obligations. We might meet another Indigenous person in the street, and when they say, "What's your country?" then they might know then that their story is connected to your story or songline, and that will set the terms of your relationship with that person, which also might come with a specific set of protocols, which you might need to observe with that person from now on. So that's why acknowledging country and the country that you're on is very important. We haven't always been allowed or afforded the opportunity to share our culture with you or even between ourselves. Since the first Protection Acts were passed in the 1860s, our people were forbidden to practice any culture, singing, dancing, language, and those acts also prescribed where we could live, how we could earn a living, if we got paid, and of course, took our children away. This is how the colonial powers, or the invaders as we would call them, tried to assimilate us into white society, so there would be no contest to land or building of the colony. And it wasn't really until the late 60s or early 70s, when those acts were finally dismantled, that people saw the ongoing destruction of our culture, which of course we were trying to protect. And then they started thinking about Indigenous human rights, and in particular, our right to self-determination and the right to practice and maintain our culture and live in freedom. I'm so pleased to say that we've come some way to help rectifying that. And now we have so many communities rebuilding cultural practices and showing so much pride. Our culture is a gift to us and to this country. And I'm so pleased that this event today goes some way towards sharing and understanding so that we can all learn together. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
76 years ago, the United Nations was created as a vehicle of hope for a world emerging from the shadow of a catastrophic conflict. Today, the women and men of the UN carry this hope forward around the globe. COVID-19, conflicts, hunger, poverty, and the climate emergency remind us that our world is far from perfect. But they also make clear that solidarity is the only way forward. We need to come together to tackle great challenges and advance the Sustainable Development Goals. By ensuring that every person, everywhere, has access to COVID-19 vaccines sooner rather than later. By securing and upholding the rights and dignity of all people, especially the poorest and most disadvantaged girls and women and children and young people. By seeking an end to the conflicts that scar our world. By making bold climate commitments to save our planet and living up to them. And by building global governance that is more inclusive, networked and effective, as detailed in my recent report, Our Common Agenda. The values that have powered the UN Charter for the last 76 years, peace, development, human rights and opportunity for all, have no expiry date. As we mark UN Day, let's unite behind these ideals and live up to the full promise, potential and hope of the United Nations.
Well, good morning all. I'd like to begin by thanking Philippa McDermott for welcoming us and for sharing the acknowledgement of country on behalf of all of us. And I must admit that when I reflect on what she said, and when I reflect on the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights some 73 years ago on Human Rights Day, it's actually easy to feel a little bit disillusioned, because it's all too easy to look at our past and to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and see a promise that still largely waits to be fulfilled. Every day around the world, we can point to example after example where we've fallen short of the ideals. Despite saying never again on so many occasions, genocide has not yet been left once and for all in the past. Despite Article 4 declaring that no one should be held in slavery or servitude, it's estimated that over 40 million people around the world still live in modern slavery. And despite the proliferation of human rights instruments over the last 73 years, the past 18 months has seen, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, what the Democracy Index 2020 have described as the biggest rollback of individual freedoms ever undertaken by governments during peacetime. Now, there is much to be thankful for when we look at Australia's overall pandemic response, as the actions that have been taken have undoubtedly protected public health and saved lives. But that doesn't change the fact that the restrictions that we've all experienced have come at a significant cost. For families that have been separated by closed borders, Australians overseas who've been unable to return home, people with disabilities facing compromised services as a result of lockdowns, and students forced to spend long periods learning from home, to name just a few. These restrictions haven't just been minor inconveniences. They've affected the very connections that give meaning to our lives. So, as I say, given the past 18 months, it's very easy to be disillusioned when you think about human rights. And yet, as Eleanor Roosevelt famously said, it is better to light a candle than curse the darkness. So today, on Human Rights Day, I'd like to do that in two respects. First, looking at the Universal Declaration itself. It's a mark of just how far we've come in terms of embedding human rights ideals that it's simply so easy to forget what a milestone this document was and is. To have the nations of the world recognise that basic rights and freedoms are the inherent birthright of every individual human being, and to accept that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. These are ideas that over the course of human history have been very much the exception rather than the rule. Secondly, being here today is a reminder of the candles that are lit every single day by so many individuals. When we talk about the Universal Declaration, it can often feel abstract and removed, like it's something that applies to faraway people in faraway lands. But the speakers today remind us of a really important truth, that human rights reside much closer to home. Again, I'm reminded of the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who said to the United Nations in 1958, and I paraphrase, "Where, after all, do universal rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." The power of these words, to me, is their recognition that human rights are born from our common humanity and intimately connected to our daily lives, which means that each and every one of us has a role to play, starting in small places, close to home, in upholding and uplifting human rights. This brings me back to my starting thought, and I'll finish on this. It is easy to feel disillusioned, particularly given the last 18 months, when we think about human rights. But that's why this event is so inspiring. It's a timely reminder that while the Universal Declaration was and is a milestone document, human rights only really come to life when each of us choose to give them meaning in our daily lives. Each of my fellow speakers today has done just that. They've chosen to light the candles rather than just cursing the darkness. I hope today they inspire you to do the same. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we gathered on and pay my respects to elders past and present. I am on Gadigal land. This land is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. It is a real privilege to be here with you all on this day. And I speak to you today as a Green Senator, but also as someone who has some understanding and experience of discrimination and marginalization. One of the questions that I get asked most often is how a migrant Muslim woman of color who has the system solidly stacked against her is in parliament. And people ask this question for a good reason. We have a problem when multicultural Australia lives and breathes on our streets, in our suburbs, but disappears in our whitewashed parliaments. I am an outsider in this world, viewed by many as not having the right to be there at all. Since taking up my role in public life, I receive a daily barrage of hate and abuse directed at me. And no matter what I say, my motives are constantly questioned, whether advocating for animal welfare, for fee-free university and TAFE, on women's rights or LGBTQI justice, or speaking out against racism. The abuse thrown at me by my detractors is always the same. It's about who I am. Where I was born and what I look like are permanent marks used to render me and many others like me irrelevant and voiceless. I actually never expected this of Australia. Growing up in Pakistan, which was once colonized by the British, the narrative that had filtered down to me was that of Western superiority. It was as if we, the colonized, had created problems of inequality, poverty, and patriarchy, and white people had all the solutions. My impression that Australia was a just and equal society was shattered when I migrated here. While things were different compared to Pakistan, gender inequality, racism, and First Nations injustices were the reality. They still are. It showed me the falsehood of my assumptions. I realized that the fight for justice, for those who are marginalized, especially people, is a global struggle. It needs global solidarity and action if we are to address it. At the end of the day, we must tackle the underlying root causes of inequality and the imbalance of power by recognizing that we live in a fundamentally unjust world, a world where Global North has long had a colonial and extractive relationship with the Global South, a world where inequality between different parts of the globe is one of the most urgent emergencies facing humanity, a world in which where you are, born decides more of what your life will be like than any other circumstance, ability, or potential. A world where many international conflicts and humanitarian disasters owe their genesis to arbitrary lines on a map drawn by colonialists in London, Paris, or Washington. This is a grave injustice, but we must remember that inequality is not a natural phenomenon. As the Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano said, poverty is not written in the stars. Underdevelopment is not one of God's mysterious designs. Poverty in the Global South is the result of colonization and the ongoing legacy of colonialism that continues to this day. This extraction of wealth, and with it, the abuse of human rights and the rights of nature, is just a historic problem. It is an ongoing one. To change that, Australia must look beyond its borders, not as a nation hungry for resources, not as a nation suspicious or fearful of others, and not as an ally of a war machine, but a friend of the people who are fighting oppression, marginalization, and injustices wherever they may be. We all know that human rights are hard fought for, but we also know that they are so worth fighting for, so we must. As Angela Davis said, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start by first thanking Philippa for the very warm welcome and acknowledgement for all of us here today. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm standing here in Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I bring greetings from my peoples, the Quandamooka peoples, from Minjerribah, or you may know that as North Stradbroke Island, just off the coast of Brisbane. Thank you to the organisers for the opportunity also to speak today, and it is an important day for all of us to reflect on the progress that we've achieved so far. And I'd like to pick up on Lorraine's introductory comments when we talk about our particular campaign stemming from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and our campaign for a voice that is guaranteed by the Australian Constitution. Lorraine's comments that we can sometimes all too easily focus on the challenges that remain and the blockages that stand before us in trying to achieve our goal. And sometimes when I think nearly 5 years on from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, next year will be the 5th anniversary on the 26th of May. It's easy to sometimes think of the challenges and the lack of progress and the frustrations that haven't been achieved. Well, what I'd like to say today, as someone who was closely involved in the creation of the Uluru Statement, someone who's been passionately involved since to try and bring it to life, is that we are as close as we've been to achieving that first reform out of the Uluru Statement, a voice that is guaranteed in the Constitution. With regards to the theme today, our campaign is very much about giving voice. It's about giving a voice to those voices in our communities that have been previously unheard. The aunties, the uncles, the old people, the young people, those that know our issues the best, those that live in our communities and understand the issues better than the politicians and the bureaucrats in far-flung places that make too many decisions with little knowledge about what actually works in our community. So I want to do a couple of things. I'd like to just reiterate that the campaign for a voice is a very, very simple concept. We want a representative body to advise parliaments on issues relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This is the foundation. This is our best chance at really coming to terms with closing the gap on the issues like education and health, justice, and employment, and the issues that our communities are working on in a day-to-day basis. Bring the expertise of those people from our communities closer to where decisions are made. This will empower parliaments, this will empower the politicians, this will empower the bureaucrats to make better laws and policies. And ultimately, it's about getting better outcomes for our mob on the ground. Secondly, we want a referendum to give this voice a constitutional guarantee. And our goal, and we're on target to achieve this goal, is to have a referendum in the next term of the federal parliament. It's time that we've been talking about this issue for many decades. It's an issue that our people have been talking about for a long time. We've run every single committee process. We've run every single examination into how this might actually work. And we're now getting to the crunchy end of that whole movement. And we see this next term of parliament as our real opportunity to have that referendum, to give that voice the constitutional guarantee. And that constitutional guarantee will do two things. It will finally solve the outstanding question of genuine recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution, and a mission that started at the creation of this modern nation of Australia in 1901, when not only were we excluded from the Constitution, there were provisions put in there to actively discriminate against us. And so the referendum on our voice will also give the voice, really importantly, a practical continuity that it needs over generations to deal with these issues that are facing our communities. we know that we're not going to fix them in one electoral cycle. We know we're not going to fix them, some of them not even in my lifetime. So the Voice needs this constitutional guarantee to ensure that it can survive changes in government, changes in ministers, to make sure that that fearless and frank advice is always being heard and not being given at risk of being abolished, as we've seen with previous voices in our history. One of the things, if nothing else, I'd like you to consider and take away from this particular short, sharp session today is that we are genuinely closer than what we have been over the last few years. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we'll soon see a design for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Minister Ken White has been working on a process over the last couple of years. And so we'll soon actually have a model with some detail to really understand what this voice will look like. And that will give assurances to people that this is a very safe, a very modest, a very practical change that Australians can support. Secondly, and again, it's not something that's talked about a lot, but there is and has been for many, many years bipartisanship on this question of a referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition. Both the current government and opposition took election commitments back in 2019, and those election commitments have been continuous since 2007. So there is political bipartisanship, regardless of sometimes what you see in the media, on this issue of Indigenous constitutional recognition. Our challenge is to turn that into a referendum on the Voice in the next term. We've got the people on our side. So through our campaign, we do a lot of work trying to understand where the Australian people sit on this particular issue. If a referendum were held around about now, we know that 57% of Australians would support that referendum. And while we hear often that there's great opposition to this question, only 16% of the Australian public would oppose a vote on a voice at a referendum. So we're often told that the Australian people won't support this, or that this is too hard for the Australian people to get on board. That's not the actual truth, and that reflects a lot of the conversations that I and many other supporters have been having over many, many years on this particular issue. So just be aware that we are far closer than what some would like us to believe. Australians are very much mobilised and galvanised to support this for three key reasons. They see it as a fair go. This is hitting that quintessential Aussie idea of fair go, something that just needs to happen. They see it as a practical change, and they see it as a moment of unity for our country. And obviously, with what's happened with COVID over the last few years, our country needs a unifying moment, and this is the issue that can actually bring the country together. So I'd like to thank you all for your support that you've given over the years, and make sure that you know that we're getting close. We're getting close. The momentum is with us, and with your continued support and your continued energy, we're going to see this. We're going to achieve this in the next term of Parliament. So thank you very much. All the best for the rest of this session, and I hope you all have a great break with your families.
My true strength is my identity.
Women are the social fabric of our communities.
And the glue that holds everything together.
What makes me strong is the 6 generations of strong women
that taught us about country.
Culture is at the heart for us, for everything we do.
We are sovereign women.
It is time to listen to our voices now.
First Nations women have countless strengths and live diverse and vibrant lives. This is a fundamental truth, too often unrecognised. These strengths are tied right back to our first mothers to walk this continent. The power of our women was set down with our law when the land, waterways, peoples, animals and plants were forming. Our women hold rich knowledge about all existence, knowledge about our interwoven relationships through kinship, about the life and health of plants and animals, of how to govern society and care for country, and how to birth and raise generations of children. Knowledge that we carry and continue to pass on through law, culture, language, and ceremony as carers, teachers, leaders, healers, and survivors. Our women adapt and thrive while sustaining the oldest living societies on Earth.
But sadly, Australia continues to not recognise this truth of the significance of our First Nations women and girls. It all started at colonisation, when a lie was told that this land, our land, belonged to no one. With it came an entirely foreign social, economic, and legal system. The structure of our societies, our values, and our knowledge systems were all threatened, seen as inferior to Western ways. We were marginalised, undervalued, and silenced as they took our land, committed acts of violence such as rape, removed our children, and forced us into indentured labour. As women, we were discriminated against on the basis of race, sex, and gender. Everything we knew, loved, and held close was on the brink of being destroyed forever. But we never gave up. No matter what we face, we rise. We will always rise. Our women remain the backbone of our communities. We hold up society, filling every gap. But still today, where decisions are made about our lives, our voices are not there. Our absence has consequence. We remain invisible to policy and lawmakers. We are not heard, not recognised, and not included, which means the structures they design do not meet our basic rights or help us realise our dreams. In this system, stereotypes fueled by racism, sexism, and all forms of discrimination meet and create inequality and exclusion, impacting us as we move through life. These unequal and discriminating structures block access to resources and services like adequate housing, safe maternal supports, health, and financial security. They limit our choices in education, employment, and where we can live. They cause people to judge us when we are shopping, catching transport, applying for a job, or seeking help. And they put us at ever greater risk of incarceration and our children being taken away. But it doesn't have to be this way. Through our voices, through We Yaniyu Dangani, we can see a future where Australia's structures and society recognise our women, children and families as existing at the centre of intergenerationally healed, healthy and vibrant societies. Because when we centre our women, entire communities benefit.
In this future, the structures and supports are in place for our children to be born surrounded by family and close to community. We grow within our culture, supported by kinship and surrounded by our languages. From our earliest years, we are educated in our knowledges, in balance with Western learnings. Our elders weave lessons of connections to country in classrooms expanding beyond four walls. Paid and unpaid care are considered vital to the functioning of all aspects of society. Our girls and women grow ever more confident, seizing life opportunities and pursuing their dreams in education and work. At every stage of life, we can choose to live on and access our homelands to develop and engage in culture-based institutions and economies. It has never been more urgent to make this future a reality and put the lives of our First Nations women, children and families at the heart of decision-making, where we form the structures that support life for us all.
Together, we can overcome discrimination and achieve equality to build a stronger, fairer, and more inclusive nation. It is time for First Nations gender justice and equality. Australia, come on this journey with us.
Okay, can I talk? Yep. Hello, everyone. So nice to see you. Welcome to the panelists and also the attendees. I can't see you guys, the attendees, but it's nice to see your wonderful faces. Thank you, panelists, so far for sharing your points. It's been wonderful. My name is Sina. I'm a Persian and a Baha'i. One of the main objectives of the Baha'i faith and its adherents is actually to be of service to humanity. Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, states, "The world is but one country and mankind its citizens." The song I will be playing for you tonight is today is Shiraz, dedicated for the unity of humanity with its intrinsic diversity and for your joy and radiance.
Thank you so much. That was Sina Karimi. For anyone who saw our chat, there was a flurry of activity. A few people saying that they were in the midst of dancing, just talking about how talented you are. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, and really capped off a really wonderful start. And thank you again to our other speakers. I feel a bit embarrassed to continue, but let's push ahead. So before we do move on to the next theme, I would like to start with a little bit about my own story. So as a journalist at SBS News, my work sees me cover stories with both national and international focus. I travel across Australia and around the world. Well, not so much lately for obvious reasons, but I from cave rescues in Thailand to refugee crises in Ethiopia. And whether I'm in remote Indigenous communities in far north Queensland, the streets of Hong Kong during a 2 million person march against government oppression, or even just walking the streets of my neighbourhood in Sydney with my wife and twins, I've been blessed to see the very best in our humanity. And not only that, see how similar we all are. Of course, I've also seen firsthand the trauma this world can bring, but hearkening back to that lovely quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, it's the humanity, even in the darkest situations, that continues to resonate with me, and seeing those examples of people who are lighting the candle rather than cursing the darkness. So in 2018, I was sent to Thailand after 12 school kids and their football coach, who himself was a young man in his 20s, became trapped in a narrow cave several kilometres long in the country's north. This was a story that captivated the globe. No one seemed to know how these young boys, some were as young as 9, could possibly be rescued alive. They were trapped for weeks. The day we arrived was about 10 days in, and on that day, a volunteer rescuer who was an ex-Navy SEAL had died in the cave due to a lack of oxygen. And that reinforced just how dangerous and delicate this rescue operation was. And it affected the spirits a little bit about, well, if an ex-Navy SEAL couldn't survive, how could these boys? As this was all happening, the major international interest was bringing news outlets from around the world. While I was there, I even bumped into a couple of Hollywood producers who were there watching it all unfold. But most importantly, there were hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. Outside the cave complex where we all were, there was just this massive international community that had formed. There were tents and stalls set up all over, and that was mainly by volunteers who simply wanted to help in any way, and they didn't want to feel as though they were doing nothing. There were locals who drove from one end of Thailand to the other. They were cooking all different types of food at all hours. The most delicious noodles really spring to mind when I say that, and then handing them out to whoever needed them. Others were handing out water, rain ponchos. There was a brother and sister as young as the kids trapped inside the cave who, along with their mum, were giving out massages. I remember the boy saying, "I just want to help." So the generosity of the human spirit was always on full display. It was inspirational and it was powerful. So the boys were eventually rescued, every one of them alive and healthy over the course of a 3-day operation. They were brought out in small groups each day, knocked out with anesthetic, strapped to a scuba diver, and then they traveled through this complex cave filled with water. And at this stage, the non-rescuers in our new community were no longer right outside the cave. Police had moved us just a bit down the road. So we were anxiously waiting in this kind of courtyard of a local government building, hoping for confirmation. So when the call came out, and it was in the evening, when it was confirmed everyone, including the rescuers, were out safe and sound, it was as though an impromptu party had erupted. Everyone was elated and they were celebrating with such emotion. People had held on to that hope despite how long it dragged on for, despite the setbacks and an unfortunate death along the way. And it just meant so much to everyone to see those boys out. So in the immediate aftermath, during all this jubilation, I was conducting interviews for our coverage, getting people's reactions. And among them, I interviewed 2 women who were volunteers. And our brief exchange sits among one of the greatest moments of my career. So I asked them what it meant for them to see these boys out safely. And one of the women uttered a phrase I'll never forget. She said, "Before today, I had no sons. Now I have 13. It warms my heart till today. And I suppose this is what today is all about, talking about our common humanity. What makes us similar can so often be forgotten, overlooked, ignored in the face of our own personal dilemmas, or it's simply just not realized. But when we really see that we are all human, who love, who feel, who love delicious noodles, who we can understand. And when it comes to those less fortunate, understand the plight of their situation and respond with respect and common decency. Now, it's time to move on to our next theme, COVID impact on human rights, starting with an eye-opening video provided by Human Rights Watch on the impact of COVID-19. This will be followed by our speakers, Dr. Graham Thom, Refugee Coordinator for Amnesty International of Australia, Dr. Dinesh Palipana, OAM 2021, Queensland Australian of the Year and Doctors with Disabilities, Toby Marshall, Workplace Age Discrimination and Age Advocate, David Cross, Australian Director at Zoe Foundation involved in child labour. And then we'll close this theme with a heartfelt song called Get Through Tomorrow from Kirsten Moore, who has been inspired by the work she does at the Zoe Foundation. Please enjoy.
Since the coronavirus was first identified in Wuhan in December, Chinese authorities have punished doctors for raising the alarm, detained citizen journalists for reporting on the epidemic, and removed social media posts critical of the government's handling of the crisis. Governments should respect the rights to freedom of expression and access to information.
Human Rights Watch has a track record of documenting violations of older people's human rights. With the coronavirus outbreak, we will be vigilant in monitoring to ensure governments put their rights at the center of their responses and do not undermine them.
COVID-19 is a risk to women's rights. Women make up the majority of healthcare, social service, and domestic workers, and are on the front lines of this disease. Authorities should take steps to reduce harm to women and girls and ensure that responses do not perpetuate gender inequity.
More than 1 billion young people have been affected by the school closures worldwide. There can be a disproportionate effect on at-risk children, like those with disabilities, refugees, and those from very low-income families. Governments need to ensure these young people are especially supported right now.
Millions of refugees live in close proximity in unsanitary, overcrowded refugee camps and detention centers. Rational, evidence-based measures to protect public health are not in conflict with the right to seek asylum, but rejecting asylum seekers at borders and sending them back to places where their lives are threatened is.
Lockdowns may be necessary to slow the spread of COVID-19, but limits on freedom of movement should never be imposed in an arbitrary or discriminatory way. Authorities should impose restrictions for the least amount of time necessary and provide support for people who are left alone or trapped in abusive situations.
I would also like to thank Philippa for her powerful welcome. I am on Camaragal land, sovereign Aboriginal land, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It is fair to say that COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on refugees and those seeking asylum, both globally and specifically for those looking to Australia for safety. When we focus on Australia, we could talk about the hard border closure and its impact on people fleeing persecution, being able to even reach Australia to seek asylum. Alternatively, we could focus on the impact for those subjected to Australia's cruel offshore detention regime. For instance, the 120 men still trapped in PNG where COVID-19 is rife, or the men detained in the Park Hotel in Melbourne, where nearly 50% have contracted COVID-19, not to mention the delays for those lucky enough to be offered resettlement to the US or Canada. All extremely important and concerning impacts. But let's focus on the impact it has had on Australia's resettlement program. Offshore resettlement has long been a significant part of Australia's global contribution to refugee protection, and Australia has had a proud resettlement tradition since World War II. COVID-19 has had two significant impacts. First, the program has been frozen since March 2020, with those granted visas, nearly 10,000, left stranded. Second, there have been significant cuts to the program. In the 2019-20 budget, Australia estimated it would resettle 75,000 people over the next 4 years. Yet according to the Refugee Council of Australia, due to COVID-19, that number has now been revised down to 46,600, a loss of 28,000 places. The 2021 budget cut the annual program by 5,000 places, down from 18,750 to 13,750. However, the US, the UK, Canada and New Zealand all increased their programs in 2020. Sadly, even with its smaller program, Australia still only granted 5,700 visas, falling short by 7,800 places. This is the smallest program in 45 years. Thankfully, at least for those stranded, the government recently announced that travel would begin again for this group on the 1st of December. Then along came the Omicron variant, and this date was pushed back to the 15th, we hope. Even when they can finally travel, there are further complications. For instance, they will need to be fully vaccinated. How do you get fully vaccinated in countries where only 2% of the population are vaccinated? And those governments, not surprisingly, are wanting to prioritise their own citizens. All this is at a time where the crisis in Afghanistan, amongst others, has highlighted the desperate need for resettlement. To date, Australia has promised only 3,000 places for Afghans from within its quota. Yet in recent months, we have seen nearly 30,000 applications, representing 150,000 people for these limited places. So what can be done? At a minimum, Australia must restore the places lost to COVID. A one-off 20,000 places for Afghans, in addition to the humanitarian program, would be an important first step. Second, restore Australia's humanitarian program to pre-COVID levels of 18,750 annually. Finally, implement a community sponsorship program similar to Canada and now the US in response to the Afghan crisis, whereby ordinary Australians can also contribute to bringing people to safety. This would also be in addition to the humanitarian program. On World Human Rights Day, it is not too late for Australia to take action and at least undo some of the damage done due to the impact of COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me this morning. It is a huge pleasure to spend some time with you. COVID-19, it's been a challenging and interesting period for our society. I am a doctor. I work in the busiest emergency department in Australia, and I have a spinal cord injury. In 2010, after a car accident, I lost the use of everything below the chest. My fingers, my respiratory function was compromised. My ability to maintain my body temperature was compromised. And among all these other physical issues, I had problems socially as well. And it was financial, healthcare access, education, employment. Over the last year and a bit, for people with disabilities, all these problems were amplified. And for me, working in a hospital, I became all too well aware of some of these challenges that could affect the community of people with disabilities. One of the most confronting problems that I saw is healthcare rationing affecting people around the world. In some countries, they develop guidelines about how to ration life-saving healthcare like ventilation and intensive care during the pandemic. Oh, sorry, I'm getting some comments about the sound. I'll just try to fix it. Hopefully, is that any better? I'm hoping that's better. Okay, I can still hear you. Good. Thanks, Trinity. Some of the most confronting things that I saw is how healthcare rationing was affecting people with disabilities around the world. And in some parts of the world, there were actual guidelines that looked at how healthcare would be rationed if resources were stretched beyond capacity. In a particular country, the first question that they asked was, does the person have a disability? And they listed several different types of disability. And then they said, if they do have a disability, then you could consider another pathway. And down this pathway, there were options like palliative care, ward-based care, deferring intensive care, whereas for a person without a disability, the options were different. In other parts of the world, we did hear reports of people being turned away from hospitals when they did have COVID and they didn't get life-saving care. There were so many other issues that people faced as well. And to me, COVID-19 was a test about how we see the value of human life as human beings. In these forums and in these tough times, we need people that have lived experiences, people that understand these things so deeply, to be on the forums, to have a voice. What shocked me was on many federal and international forums that talked about disabilities and COVID-19, there were very few people that were both versed in healthcare and had a significant disability. This brings me to the issue of education and employment. People with disabilities face a significant gap in both accessing education and employment. The unemployment rate for people with disability around the world is significantly higher than those without. But how can we address these deeply human problems if we haven't empowered the very people that we're having conversations about to participate in these discussions? How can they participate in these discussions if we haven't empowered them with education, if they're not participating in the employment system? That is still a significant challenge that we face. And these are challenges that I faced after sustaining a spinal cord injury. My education was at jeopardy and my employment was certainly at jeopardy. But today, I'm fortunate to have both of those things so I can participate in conversations like this that can change the world, hopefully, for all people. As we move forward, I encourage you all to please fight for each other and to take these conversations forward and to make sure that all humans have equitable access and an equitable chance at seeking happiness and life. Thank you.
Hello, am I on? I can't hear, there's a big rainstorm here. Guys, the big question in advanced Western economies, including Australia, which abuse of human rights does the most damage? Which abuse damages millions of Australians, both their mental health and the last 20 or 30 years of their lives. It's the abuse created by one number, the year of your birth. 1981 or earlier, then you're already suffering from the abuse of employment ageism, or you are about to, even though you have no idea you are. Employment ageism is easily the most damaging part of ageism. Other parts, such as being invisible, particularly when shopping or buying stuff, is a problem, but relatively minor, and one we can address on our own to some extent. What we can't solve on our own is employment ageism, because it's a systemic, industry-wide problem. When does employment ageism start? At age 40. We know because that's when the average time spent unemployed starts to rise, and it increases every year thereafter. 40, that's so young. And COVID has made it even worse, as many over 40s lost their jobs and are on the unemployment queues for the first time, and are shocked how hard it is to even get an interview. So how many Australians over 40 will suffer from this career-damaging abuse? All of us will, to varying degrees. So why do well over half our over 40s believe that employment ageism is a myth? It's because they don't know how the recruitment industry, the recruitment system works. Understanding recruiting starts with knowing who does 90% of it. It's the under 40s. These millennials almost universally believe the four myths, the four stereotypes about older people, despite all four of the stereotypes having been comprehensively debunked by huge amounts of research in Australia and globally. All stereotypes are rubbish, and the reality is the complete opposite of what millennials believe. But there's no time in this short talk to share the research with you. How does recruiting happen now, today? The young recruiter is told to hire someone under 40 as they're more productive, or will better fit our young team. So they run an advertisement, quickly guess the age of anyone who is probably over 40 and automatically reject them. The few polite recruiters send an email blatantly lying about the reason for rejection. For most applicants, however, the silence is just deafening and depressing. Recruiters also run searches on LinkedIn and their own databases, where you are briefly considered until they see your age. So you don't even know you were considered and rejected. Then there's a compounding factor for older women and the disabled. Both groups are discriminated against at all ages. However, the abuse is relatively much worse when they are older, particularly for the disabled. And the worst thing of all, our governments, the NFPs, and even the United Nations believe that the solution is for the mature to take personal responsibility to fix it themselves. We cannot fix a broken industry-wide system on our own. The result is the government continues to spend billions on totally useless programs. All this ignorance and prejudice has delivered Australia the perfect storm of abuse. What can you do about it? Speak up, confront it, shout out, we've had enough. Challenge the stereotypes. Help employers and our government understand that they discriminate and how they can stop it. To learn more about the causes and finally practical and low-cost solutions, just go to stableandwise.com. Thank you.
I also want to thank Philippa for that wonderful acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In 2009, when I heard there was 40,000 children trapped in sex slavery in Thailand, my entire world was rocked. I was living in Australia, I was running a business, and I thought there is no way that something like this could be happening in the world. So I read statistics, so I downloaded government reports, and I found out that it was true. I learned there were 40.3 million people in modern slavery, and a quarter of them were children. My life was changed forever. So I exited from business and I moved to northern Thailand in 2010 to help an organisation called Zoe. Zoe works to prevent child trafficking. We work alongside law enforcement to rescue kids, and we provide holistic support services to help restore the lives of trafficking survivors. I remember one day Zoe was part of a raid with law enforcement, and there were some kids that were rescued, and nearby there was this bowl of lollies. And so post-raid they were at Zoe, and there was this one boy and he just wouldn't touch it. Other kids would walk past and take lollies, but this boy, absolutely no way would he touch it. But I soon realised that he'd been part of a system where everything in his life had strings attached. He thought that if he took something, then that would mean that someone would come through the door and abuse him or rape him, like what had happened to him so many times before. I've seen firsthand the effects of trauma and abuse on children's lives, but I've also seen children's lives be transformed. You know, the numbers are absolutely overwhelming, and it can often seem like the problem is too big. So all we do is we focus on helping one. We help one child today, we help one tomorrow, we help one next week. If there's one child trapped in slavery, then that is one too many. So we will continue to fight until every one is free. I mean, as a parent, you know, what wouldn't you do for your own child? So why would I accept that life for someone else's child? You and I can make a difference. I read reports years ago from Johns Hopkins University that said over a 10-year period that Australians were the #1 sexual exploiters of children in Thailand. Still today, Australians are part of a growing problem of child exploitation, both in person and also online. Detective Superintendent Jane Welsh talks about how trafficking and the production of child abuse material has exploded during the coronavirus lockdown. Aussies are spending more time at home and online. And in Thailand, I've seen firsthand the absolutely devastating effects of COVID on the vulnerable. COVID has increased people's vulnerability. In our work with Thailand Internet Crimes Against Children, a government task force, we can see how perpetrators are continually trying new methods to deceive and lure vulnerable children and their families. And there has been a significant increase in online sexual exploitation of children. Australians are involved in paying for, producing, and facilitating the abuse of children. So as Australians, what can we do? Well, we can start by remembering that we actually can make a difference. And secondly, if we really want to make a difference, we have to educate ourselves. There are things each of us can do right now that will help to see an end to child trafficking. And if you're on this call today and you're like, I don't even know where to start, well, Zoe has like a free course we can do to help you get started to learn more. But we can make a difference to one child's life. You know, have you ever thought about the things you buy or who made them? You know, right now there's 160 million children in child labour. So that's nearly 1 in every 10 children. They're producing cocoa, coffee beans, clothing, sports equipment, and there's even kids working in mines to source metals and minerals for electronics. And this is where you and I can make a massive difference, because it's about the products we buy and what we choose to consume. We can actually demand that companies stop exploiting children in their supply chain. The Australian government, the Australian Parliament's currently considering the Customs Amendment Bill and looking to ban goods produced by forced labour and stop that from entering into Australia. The bill hasn't been passed yet, So you and I have the power to influence that through our local representatives, but we also have power to influence companies because they want to sell products to you and to me. And we can make sure that they know that we will not buy goods that have been produced by kids in modern slavery. You see, you are the voice for a child that has no voice. The issue of child trafficking exists in every continent, including Australia. This is not just an overseas problem. It directly affects us, what we buy, what we wear, the coffee we drink, even the shoes probably right now that are on our feet. Australians are part of the problem, but more so we could be part of the solution. Thank you.
I'm here as a voice for trafficked children who are unable to speak for themselves. As a survivor of sexual violence myself, I wrote this song, Get Through Tomorrow, as a reminder that we can hope for a better future in times of great despair. Sometimes we are so broken that the thought of getting up in the morning is too much. But if you did it yesterday, you can do it again today and tomorrow and so on until one day you wake up and you realize that you are no longer just surviving, but you are finally truly living your life again. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy.
So it goes again, around this same bed, twists, turns, lessons learned. Watch out, we'll get burned. Time now to think, too much time, so we sink into the walls. Don't cry as you fall. Woke up yesterday. We can do the same today. Fight on, let go. We'll get through tomorrow. It's alright somehow as you hold me now and brush my tears away. You say it's okay. We woke up yesterday, so we can do the same today. Fight on, let go. We'll get through tomorrow. It's not a test, no hope. This freedom now is no joke. And I pray with my eyes wide.
take a breath. Kirsten, that was wonderful. Very heartfelt, sobering. You could really feel the emotion behind that, and just such a meaningful, important message, which as David said, which I think really resonated, that the notion that we can all make a difference, which Toby, Dinesh, Graham all touched on, and our other speakers earlier too. So thank you all so much for that first half. This takes us now to our short break, where we would love to hear from you. In the meantime, to invite you to participate in the online chat. Use your phone to access the on-screen QR code. Make a tea, make a coffee. Don't go too far. It's just a very short break. And after that, the esteemed Honourable Verity Firth will take over as your second co-host for the next hour. Thank you again.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you back. Hope you've had a quick refresh and have your seatbelts on for the second half of our program. It's been really great to hear your voice on some of the topics and themes covered this morning. Human Rights Day is observed by the international community every year on the 10th of December. It commemorates the day in 1948 that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The 2021 theme, so the theme for today's session is equality, reducing inequalities, advancing human rights. Equality is aligned, of course, with the 2030 Agenda and with the UN shared framework on leaving no one behind, equality and non-discrimination at the heart of sustainable development. This includes addressing and finding solutions for deep-rooted forms of discrimination that have affected women and girls, Indigenous peoples, people of African descent, LGBTQ+ people, migrants and people with disabilities, amongst others. Equality, inclusion and non-discrimination. In other words, a human rights-based approach to development. This is the best way to reduce inequalities and resume our path towards realising the 2030 Agenda. Our next speakers are doing just that to shape the future of human rights and advocate human rights in sport. So we will start with, you'll be hearing from a number of people, and we're going to start with Lucy Stronach, who is the Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations. Joe Metcalf, Managing Director for GHD Foundation, to hear from our corporate sponsors. Catherine Madziva, Miss Sahara pageant winner. Rabi Zalman Kastel and Kalisha Bennett, Together for Humanities Foundation. Miriam Vazida, CEO Media Diversity Australia. And we will finish the segment with Roger, a refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo, presenting a heart-rendering poem, Mural of a Refugee Child.
According to the 2021 Global Gender Gap Report, it is going to take us an average of nearly 136 years to reach gender parity. This amount grew by an enormous 36 years from just 12 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. The reality is that globally, women and girls experience violations of their rights on a fundamental level each and every day. What truly frightens me is that I will never experience genuine equality in my lifetime. During my work with the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and in my role as Australia's youth rep to the UN, it has become apparent to me that some human rights for some groups of people still seem to be up for debate. Over the past year, I've spoken with thousands of young, vulnerable and marginalised people, and there is a genuine sense of uncertainty about what the future holds, particularly in the human rights space. This year, we found the top 10 issues to young Aussies were as follows: climate change, gender inequality, racial discrimination, healthcare, education, sexual harassment and assault, the justice system, LGBTQ+ issues, economic equality, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights. Our discussion centred on the critical importance of understanding, upholding and promoting equality and fairness in these spaces, particularly as young people in the last decade alone have faced crises on an unparalleled level, infringing on genuine progress to a just and equitable society. During my consultations, participants were tasked with identifying tangible recommendations for policy and decision makers. 3 emerged within the rights space. First, an understanding of new human rights. Second, the mainstreaming of rights in educational spaces. And third, youth-led decision-making in the human rights sphere. New or modern rights is a concept that I heard discussed throughout the country. The idea that traditional or more simple rights, such as the right to vote, the right to shelter, or the right to education, simply don't cut it anymore. Instead, we need rights that reflect the incredible intersectionality and diversity of our nation and our young people in particular. We are lacking nuance in how we interpret and uphold fundamental rights in Australia, and as such, marginalised and vulnerable groups are suffering. Despite this, we are seeing steps in the right direction. Recently, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognising the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. This monumental decision has created new protections for various vulnerable groups and demonstrates a movement towards a new understanding of modern rights. Second, we need to mainstream human rights, most fundamentally in our education system. Many young people I spoke to across Australia were largely unsure of their most basic rights and were frightfully unaware of how to uphold or defend them. I listened to countless stories of exploitation and discrimination in all of our key systems, from health to justice to employment. The very clear lack of rights-based learning embedded into our national curriculum is failing our young people. We aren't equipping them with the skills, the knowledge and the resources to navigate these spaces, let alone recognise and combat injustice when it confronts them. As such, we need to incorporate the work of our human rights institutions into our education system by showing young people how to access and utilise the sources that are available to them, from various UN committees to the Australian Human Rights Commission. Any progress in this space is truly welcome because currently the silence is deafening. My final recommendation is centred on prioritising youth-led decision-making in key human rights spaces. During my role as youth rep, I became very familiar with the notion of tokenistic and superficial engagement. Young people consistently felt that policy and decision makers would offer a space for participants to share concerns, only to see a very tangible lack of action based on their recommendations and ideas. Moving through this pandemic, we have to take youth participation one step further and push for young people as decision makers in the human rights arena. Our global youth have proven their competence as leaders and change makers in the face of current crises and deserve to equally participate, particularly considering the creativity, the diversity, passion and lived experiences they bring to the table. To conclude, our young people need 3 key changes for the future of human rights: a modernisation of our human rights, increased education on how to access and uphold rights, and a seat at the decision-making table. I would like to finally thank the UNAA New South Wales for hosting this wonderful event. I think it's really important to start dialogues and host these kinds of discussions so that we can better understand and promote human rights. And I am very hopeful that we will begin to see true progress and change. Thank you.
Out of the many roles I imagined for myself, being a beauty pageant queen was never one. Growing up, I was such a tomboy who loved all things adventure, sports-based, and I had an insatiable need for speed. With such fun came bumps and bruises and grazes, and my parents would lovingly cover the cuts with Band-Aids, if you can see them. It always fascinated me how this flesh-toned wound dressing was designed to protect the cut while camouflaging with my skin. However, this pale patch of thin plastic stood out on my deep and melanated skin. This was my earliest memory of my awareness that as an African girl with melanated skin, my needs were not always taken into account in the process of product design and development. This realization developed into an understanding of the general absence of African representation in different arenas of life. This lack of representation extended into other spaces such as the corporate world, parliament, government, education, creative spaces, entrepreneurship, sports, beauty and fashion industry, or leadership portfolios in general. My Band-Aid experience and countless others alike stayed with me into my adult years, like a fly that seemed to hover and buzz around on a sticky summer's day. Can you imagine the feeling and the reality that nothing is quite made for you? I and many African women have full lips, hair with dreadlocks, maybe braids, maybe twists, wigs or short fros. We also have broad noses, a feature of our ancestors, and also rich, deep skin tones. Living in the Western world, fair skin, colored eyes, and hair that dances and moves in the evening breeze is often the standard of beauty, a standard that is limited in its definition. If this is the standard of beauty, then people like myself will never be included. Being invisible in a place you call home and desperately want to be a part of, and realizing that you're an afterthought and not the intended audience is at the very least exhausting. It makes you question your own value as a human being and the right to participate in the fullness of life. My speech today is not simply about outward appearance and beauty standards in the Western world. It runs deeper. It is the value our society places on an individual's worth, the value of developing products specifically for one's needs and wants, and the unequal weight of one's voice, the unequal weight one's voice holds, and who is deemed worthy of being seen and heard. So how does this all relate to our everyday lives and to today? Well, let me ask you this. How are you including the multifaceted voices of others, particularly women of African descent, in your businesses, organizations, companies, friendship groups, or any other space? Have you considered the needs and wants of African women? This is not just about being considered pretty and being part of mainstream standard of beauty. It is about the future involvement and participation of African women and girls in shaping and leading economic, political, and cultural narratives. It is about weaving our valuable contributions, needs, and wants into the fabric of the societies we are a part of, to be seen and to be heard. My vision and desire is for a society where there is equal representation and visibility of all. Miss Sahara provides a safe place for this to be achieved, to increase the visibility of African women in mainstream realms of beauty and fashion, business, education, public speaking, and so many others. This initiative, founded in 2018, empowers young African women to accomplish all their life goals and dreams, now and into the future. With the Miss Sahara initiative, I am now part of the representation I needed to see growing up. A representation and image of a young, successful African woman excelling in all of her various pursuits. Miss Sahara is an entry point in shaping conversations about the future of human rights pertaining to young African women in the diaspora, and ensuring that their voices and interests are discussed in casual conversations and in global forums such as this. It can start with something small. This morning, I went to Woolworths and got a Band-Aid to match my skin tone. Thank you.
I was once a racist. I grew up in New York in a divided neighborhood between blacks and Jews. And one moment that sticks out for me was an invitation to come to play basketball with black boys. And I refused. I dismissed it out of hand. I thought it was the strangest thing. The reason that I dismissed on that opportunity is particularly troubling in the context. There had been a lot of tension, there'd been race riots. A black child was killed by a Jewish driver in a car accident. A Jewish man had been killed by a black gang in Crown Heights in the riots of 1992. I was invited to do something about it to make it better, and I refused because I was a bigot. Today, I'm the National Director of Together for Humanity, a group that is dedicated to building understanding between people from different backgrounds and creating belonging so that everyone feels seen and heard and included. How did I go from being a Brooklyn bigot to a bridge builder? The answer is contact, meeting people like Kalisha, people from different backgrounds, and learning and hearing their stories and hearing their voices. in Together for Humanity, we are not afraid to talk about different beliefs and to hear different voices and different languages.
يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا. In my faith, Islam, God says in the Holy Quran, O mankind, we created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. What do you initially assume and think about me when you look at me today? At first glance, many assumptions are made about me, that I'm foreign, that I'm uneducated, that I'm oppressed, that I'm a terrorist. I've had racist and bigoted slurs like this and more thrown at me over the years, and no doubt countless others from my faith community have experienced similar. Little do many know or realize that I might just possibly be more Australian than they are, or that perhaps I might have more in common with them than they could possibly imagine. My background is mixed, with my father being a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, sixth-generation Australian, and my mother originating from the Cocos and Christmas Islands. I'm an Australian-born Muslim who lives with the Australian culture running through my veins and the Islamic faith manifesting in my fingertips. My grandfather flew for the Royal Australian Air Force, and my great-grandfather fought and died in World War I. Yet, I've been told to go back to where I came from, and that my way and my people are not welcome here. Despite these assumptions, my faith and mixed cultural background has enriched my life in countless ways and has in fact taught me to live as a peaceful, productive, contributing member of society. I'm a mother, an educator, a religious teacher, an international speaker, a business owner, and a few other interesting things beyond what is often initially assumed about me by the average person I pass in the street. In my work with Zalman and Together for Humanity, I speak to children and youth about my life experiences, identity, and background. I get to debunk misconceptions about my faith and community in the hope of reducing fear, prejudice, and negative assumptions about those that we deem as different or strange. I get to facilitate the exploration of difference and diversity and impact the hearts and minds of the next generation so that they meet others with genuine openness and curiosity. It is my hope that through my work, I can contribute to raising awareness about the importance of upholding the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And I believe we can do this through community projects and raising awareness, as well as through influencing our direct networks at home and work, or even through engaging with a random person that you might cross paths with. Author and social activist Grace Lee Boggs says, "You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it." As I mentioned in my opening, my faith teaches that our diversity is a great blessing, which allows us to enjoy getting to know one another. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know me, and I would love to get to know you.
And you can. Together for Humanity will make Kalisha available on Zoom to talk to children in schools across this country, anytime, any place during school times, as long as Kalisha is not already booked. She can be zoomed into a classroom in Bullsbrook, Western Australia, Northern Tasmania, or anywhere else. And with the work of Kalisha and all of the people in Together for Humanity and many other organizations and great people doing this stuff, no child should grow up to ever make a speech, begin a speech like I did. I used to be a bigot.
Greetings from Ngunnawal country, and thank you for having me today to speak on how corporates can support the progress in human rights and development. Every day in Australia, some 7.5 million employees wake up and they read their smartphone feeds like this about globally pressing issues that range from unprecedented levels of human displacement, health systems struggling under the burden of COVID, and numerous incidents of social and gender inclusion, and much, much more. The scale of this growing level of awareness is important. In Australia alone, there are over 50,000 medium to large corporations. And if you extrapolate those numbers worldwide, just for example, add another 150,000 big companies in the US, the potential impact and indeed obligation is extraordinary. So what's critical here is the growing visibility, but I think it's less important what corporates say or think they see the world needs, and more about what the world is saying it needs. So how do we stop and listen to act and leverage those numbers for a better humanity, and approach it from a position of humility in community leadership? So in preparing for today, I stopped and I asked and I tried to listen. I asked Catherine Fung, one of my interns who is heavily involved in the international youth-led social impact space. She's amazing. She said I should talk about two things we businesses can do to take action on human rights and social injustice, and it has to be beyond compliance. I added that little bit myself. The first is direct action through corporate shared value by taking what we do best as businesses and centering that around community and human needs wherever applicable. A concrete example is to take urgent action to ensure a safe climate for humanity. To do this, we need to constantly innovate and find new ways of creating meaningful value at every stage of partnership and customer or client interaction. It can't be an add-on like the older versions of corporate social responsibility are, but central to the way we create profit and competitive advantage. Inspire us to transform our business models. GHD introduced a concept called radical incrementalism. So if you think about if every one of the 10,000 of the GHD employees all made small changes, all the things called out today and more, it will add up over time to make radical progress on important issues. A concept that we hold up as a corporate call to action to achieve organisational transformation. The second point Catherine made was that the private sector should invest in younger generations. Hard to believe a youngie like Catherine said this, and I'm totally with her. So speaking to her, she reinforced that young people at the forefront of creating change, because they are now the largest users of technology and they're able to use this form to form large virtual spaces to foster collaboration and collective action. So they are best positioned to innovate and adopt emerging methodologies for digital advocacy. She also told me stories about her work with medical teams in India, where young doctors wanting to improve the health system capacities of their home country are barred by a lack of knowledge in entrepreneurship and technical innovation. So on the flip side, young engineers don't fully understand the needs of doctors, and so they're not able to innovate for the pain points experienced in a clinical setting. So I'm totally with Catherine and what she asks for. What this story highlights for me is the need for us corporates to invest both in the technical and entrepreneurial training of youth and to create opportunities for interdisciplinary and intergenerational collaboration. I heard you, Toby Marshall. This is crucial to empower everyone with the frameworks and language to lead the necessary work from which business can learn a lot from. So how do we, big corporates like GHD with big brands, down to small businesses that together represent millions of people that can put our name to and get behind them and more deeply understand youth, greater diversity of thinking and grassroots movements that are at the front line of the issue. This is because human rights, like engineering problems, can be viewed from a systems perspective, where an issue that arises in one cog of the machine affects all the others, and the fixing or improvement of one element can simply propagate throughout the entire network. The people that are directly affected, the first responders, the CSOs, NGOs, personnel that work to fix these problems, they know what is needed. We need to respect their understanding of the complexities of the issues because they know it best. So it's about sharing resources and helping them build capacity so that they can become more self-empowered to take on these challenges as experts. So it was demonstrated by 23 major global companies that support Black Lives Matter, and the Big Four and many others that put their brands behind marriage equality in Australia. Just two examples of how the role of corporate activism has shifted very quickly to a deeper and active understanding of human rights. Thank you.
Hello. I don't know about you, but when I was in my mother's womb, no one called me up and asked me whether I wanted to choose the circumstances of my birth. Nobody rang me to say, hey, would you like to choose your skin colour? Would you like to choose your gender? And hey, while we're at it, do you have a preference as to whether you'd like to be born, say, in Kabul, Afghanistan, or Kirribilli, Sydney, or Washington, DC? It's like when you're at the hospital and you get a menu for the following day. What would you like for breakfast? And you're flicking through it. That's not quite how life works, right? It's absurd that I'm even talking to you about when you were in your mother's womb. The point is, we don't choose the circumstances of our birth. We don't choose our ethnicity. We don't choose our skin colour. We don't choose our gender. There's a whole host of diversity dimensions that we hear about now, that word that is thrown around all the time, and that tends to attract mixed messages. It's a whole heap of things, elements of ourselves that we did not choose. So if we did not choose the circumstances of our birth, then why is it that so many of us ultimately face discrimination on that basis, on the basis of things that we didn't choose about ourselves? And I've asked this question, and I've posed this question before, that no one asked me about the circumstances of my birth. It so happened that I was born in Kabul, Afghanistan. And we know now, since Kabul fell over 3 months ago, that you're deeply unlucky if you happen to be born in Afghanistan. Now, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, dare I ask, did anyone ask him whether he wanted to be born in a particular country? Did he choose the circumstances of his birth? Did you choose the circumstances of yours? Now, I know the answer to that, and so do you. And the reason I ask this perhaps obvious rhetorical question is really to get us thinking about the basics. Here we are talking about human rights. Here we are talking about diversity inclusion more broadly. But there are so many people out there that are not convinced about why we need to do this. They're either sitting on the fence or they're not convinced about why identity politics. Why are we focusing on gender? Why are we focusing on culture? Why are we focusing on ethnicity, sexuality? Why are we focusing on diversity dimensions? I mean, we're all Australians, right? So the point I make is societal privilege is a real thing. We are born into levels of privilege that we absolutely have very little choice over. And the thing about privilege is that it's largely invisible to those who have the most amounts of it. The reality of the world is that we are not unbiased as much as we'd like to, and we hear lots of well-intentioned people make this exact point. Well, you know what, Mariam, I don't see colour, I don't see gender, I don't see people's ethnicity. I just take them at face value and I treat everybody the same. I treat them based on their merits. But I hate to break it to you, but we don't live and operate in a meritocracy. Unconscious bias is a real thing. No doubt you've heard about affinity bias, that we tend to be attracted to people that are very similar to us, that we gravitate towards them. As much as we'd love to say that I don't see colour, the reality of the world is such, cognitively speaking, that we do see colour. In fact, we see colour immediately. And those panellists before me have spoken to amazing examples of privilege, the very privilege of being able to go to Coles and find a Band-Aid that is matching with your skin colour, something that not everybody could do several years ago because that was not available. Had you ever turned your mind to whether you had a Band-Aid that matched your skin colour? Or whether you had a shade of foundation, as I do today, that matches your skin colour, or not so much in my case today, depending on who did your makeup. However, the point is these are privileges that you've not had to think about. And that in itself is privilege. We also know that unconscious bias operates in such a way that it happens unconsciously. Nobody wakes up in the morning and decides they're going to be a bigot today. Nobody wakes up in the morning and decides they're going to be a homophobe and a racist. The reality is it's something that happens largely unconsciously, although for some politicians you could argue that it's perhaps very conscious. If it is unconscious and we can't simply switch it off, we know that there's been Australian studies, but also equally Harvard University tests done globally that shows that unconscious bias not only is a real thing, but it has real life consequences. So according to the Harvard University test, the implicit association test, there is a preference globally. 4.5 million participants have done this. And they've shown that there is a preference when it comes to certain traits. For example, when it comes to gender, there is a preference. I won't let you, you can guess what the preference is. And this is kind of mapping out what an ideal person is like, right? The people that tend to rise to leadership positions, et cetera, et cetera. There is a preference when it comes to gender. There is a preference when it comes to skin color. There is a preference when it comes to ethnicity, and we know there is a preference when it comes to sexuality and to height and to weight. Now, you might think, yes, so what? The real life consequences are such that there are, when it comes to height, the average CEO is much taller than the average person. And there is study after study that confirms this. So why does that matter? It matters because unconscious bias is a real thing. There is absolute consequences to it. And as much as we'd like to say that it doesn't play a role, it does. So if you happen to be born in a safer room, please open the door to someone else who's born in an unsafe room. Thank you.
He is running, a poet, a soldier, a slave. His words are locked in chains, guarded by inhumane atrocity. Trying to leave the strife life behind, searching for peace. Searching for freedom to resurrect his heart again. Freedom so he can remember how to breathe. Tears for ink, his words are blurry. Stuttering, no one hears his voice. Chest heavy with sorrows. The grip of faith in God, humanity, and self is weakened. Through these treacherous passageways infected by morbid and carnage, the sages of survival are relentlessly struggling to find shelter, but we push on. This journey strips men of their masculinity. They crawl in dirt with dust in their eyes. Children forced to mend before they are taught to stand. This path of humanity is a raft of agony. Our tapestry tells a story in poetry. Sometimes it's a mystery, cause they define our characters by the misery of our question-marked continent. But we are not our circumstances. So don't hate us, don't fear us, for we are not terrorists or rebels in armed militia. We're not gangsters or witch doctors, although we possess magic in us. Our melanin does not equate to anger, laziness, and violence. We are scared. Scared to lose another daughter, another son. Not ready to die yet. We are bruised, broken, and confused. We miss home. We are just like you.
Wow, that's really powerful, wasn't it? Also inspiring segment from all of our speakers. Thank you for that. More than ever, we need to understand the role that each of us can play in shaping the future of human rights and making it part of our everyday. And I think some of the inspirational speeches we got just then shows us how everyone makes their contribution. At UTS, I lead our university's Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, where we work to ensure that our university is an agent for social change, transforming communities through research, education, and practice. 2021 has been a hard year for me. COVID-19 has come alongside a set of pressing societal challenges that include actual environmental catastrophes, such as the Australian droughts and bushfires, and also the ongoing unresolved wicked issues, including debilitating poverty, racial inequality, inequalities of housing, income, health and disease, and of course, the impending crises that is global warming and climate change. At the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, we believe that in this environment of turbulence and rupture, universities have a really important role to play as anchor institutions that support communities in transition. But what's really important is that rather than undertaking knowledge work on behalf of society, universities need to undertake knowledge work in collaboration with society, doing it in partnership, building equal and reciprocal relationships with communities, with organisations, government, not-for-profits, business. We all have to do this together. And of course, this is not just a local effort, it's a global effort. SDG Goal 17, the Sustainable Development Goal 17, explicitly talks about revitalising the global partnership for sustained development. And this goal underpins the 16 before it, as only the SDGs can be realised with strong and inclusive partnerships at the global, regional, national and local levels. It needs to be across sector and across organisations, all working for the goal of sustainable development. So partnership and collaboration, of course, is also what the United Nations Association Australia is all about. And in fact, partnerships and collaboration is what One Voice, One Humanity is all about. And so our final theme for today is about the incredible partnerships that exist between sport and human rights. It's not always something people talk about, but how powerful this partnership is. And to talk to us about sport and human rights, we welcome the following speakers. Well-known sports activist and sportsman, Craig Foster, followed by our recent 2020 Olympian, middle distance runner born in Sudan, Peter Boy. Our last speaker is Matt Levy, a very impressive and accomplished Paralympics swimmer with 3 gold, 1 silver and 3 bronze medals, and a message of courage and resilience. We look forward to hearing from all of our speakers. And after they've spoken, we will close our program with an important message from UNAA, New South Wales President, Patricia Jenkins. And once again, we are thrilled that you were able to join us on this first ever UN Day event. It promises to be a bigger and stronger event next year, and we hope that you'll join us then as well.
Sport is not neutral. It's highly political precisely because it refuses to uphold human rights law, which is the only neutrality. This is why a human rights respecting global sport industry can change the world, but it must stop promoting its social credentials without substantive action. Time for athletes, corporate partners, governments, human rights organisations, the United Nations and fans to see through the superficiality, the slogans, the banners, the platitudes and pronouncements, and call on sport to respect the rights of people everywhere. Sport escapes scrutiny because it's claimed to somehow exist outside of society, to have no responsibilities other than integrity of competitions, that it can compete with its eyes closed. But the silencing of Peng Shuai is an emblem of the political and commercial entanglement and complicity of sport. It creates, supports, masks, and ignores significant harm, and it's time for global sport and those at national level in Australia and everywhere to adopt, embed, protect, and promote human rights. Well, athletes know this very well, don't they? We see them speaking out for social justice now and throughout history. Lewis Hamilton's rainbow helmet in the Qatar and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, Naomi Osaka's George Floyd mask, Marcus Rashford's push for food security. But they're right to do so, of course, but they're carrying a burden that the sport industry should be helping to shoulder, not least because so much of the economic value of sport is built on the promotion of social responsibility initiatives. How many anti-racism signs do we need before sport tackles racism itself? How many Indigenous rounds before it speaks for Indigenous rights? How many sustainability campaigns before it stands up for climate action? From the Black Power salute to today, athletes bravely do what they must, live the slogans and believe in their responsibility to others. Then why not sport itself? We say that we're a force for good, but what about our force for bad, for harm, for abuse, for dislocation of people, for major events, for sexual abuse of female athletes around the world, for ongoing systemic racism that exists within sport governing bodies and sport itself as much as outside, for gender inequality that's deeply entrenched in the sport business? How much longer can sport look away? The 1934 FIFA World Cup in support of Mussolini, Berlin Olympics 36 and the Nazi ideology of hate. The Clean the Streets program at Atlanta 96 Olympics and the displacement of people from the favelas in 2016. And now we have a looming reckoning of sport's false claims to neutrality and to upholding principles of humanism, non-discrimination, solidarity between all peoples that the International Olympic Committee claims, for example, with the forthcoming Winter Games, Beijing 2022. IOC President Thomas Bach says we must be neutral, and I completely concur, Thomas, but you utterly misunderstand the claim. How is it possible to be neutral about crimes against humanity? There can be no neutrality to human suffering. Isn't that what the world decided in 1948? How can we run and jump, swim or kick a football in the shadow of human rights abuse on an historic scale? How can sport possibly claim that it shouldn't have regard for people being ethnically cleansed, religiously erased, oppressed and imprisoned? It's an extraordinary claim. Preposterous, really. Silence is violence. First Nations and Black Lives Matter taught us at least that much. So it's time for a new sport model, one committed to internationally recognized human rights, one that, like the Women's Tennis Association, takes action to protect the rights it so heavily promotes. If sport won't act, then stop the sloganeering, the principles, the policies and the campaigns, but the world would be so much poorer. I want to propose a better way, human rights respecting sport. And you know, sport is the perfect force to uphold human rights, precisely because human rights are the only neutrality. Every country has the same standard, same rules, no exceptions, equal for all. That is the very definition of sport. Let us be the new vanguard of human rights and hold member nations of sport to the highest standards of human conduct, including our own. And I would welcome support for refugee rights, for example, from more of Australian sport. An Olympic Games and a FIFA World Cup and other global sporting events that are a genuine force for good and people everywhere. Wow, that's a very different world. On Human Rights Day 2021, I say it's time for new sport. Thank you.
We are just humans. As I spoke after my 800-meter champion at the Olympic Games, becoming the first Australian 53 years to break the Australian record and make Australian final. I spoke those words. We are, at the end of the day, just humans. And that speaks so much more for me as an athlete, as a human myself as well. I said those exact words because at the end of the day, no matter how fast I can run, compared to everyone that I'm staring at the screens right now, it gives me no right to treat anyone any differently. And that's what I was speaking about when I said we are just humans at the end of the day. It's being able to be having that humility to know that your talents, your skills, whatever you're good at, does not give you any right to treat anyone else different. Human rights for me started early. I was born in Sudan, relocated to Egypt, and arrived in Australia in 2004 in Toowoomba, Queensland. And sport has played a major role in my life. As one, sport speaks no other languages. Sport is a universal language. To interact with all the different students at school, I played sports and it was just easy. When I go compete against the best in the world, I'm competing against everybody in different different cultures, different languages, different religions, and with all different type of obstacles and adversity in life. So when I speak about we are just humans, I'm talking about human rights, and I think it's time that sports focuses on that, and we focus on being a better person above being a better athlete. Because if we can be a better person, we become better athletes just in general. And that's what I was speaking about when I was speaking about we are just humans at the end of the day. Right now, I stand for sports. I stand for humanity. I come from two different cultures, and the question that I'm generally asked all the time is, Peter, where are you from? Where are you from? And the answer that I have is, we are just humans. My mom is Sudanese. My dad's South Sudanese. I was born in Sudan. I lived in Egypt, but I represent Australia at the highest level of sports. So when someone asks where you're from, it's just a tough question to answer, because you have all of these different countries that you represent, and then it's like, okay, why don't we see this idea that we can just represent humanity in general? Like, can't we just represent everyone in general? Like, I'm a proud Australian. I represent Australia, but I am for the people. I am representing the humanity, and that's what I speak about when I speak about humanity in sports. I think it's very important, especially no time than now, when people stand up, and sports in general has become more than sports itself. When you have people like Craig Fassad mentioned, like Marcus Rashford, people like Muhammad Ali standing for something above sports, because at the end of the day, sports ends, but humanity remains. So with that said, my talents, I will one day slow down, but for me to try to be a better person, I can maintain that and sustain that as long as possible. And yeah, thank you.
Matthew Levy here. Being born at 25 weeks premature back in 1987, I was born with cerebral palsy and vision impairment. This made it very difficult to walk, talk, do the normal things that everyone takes for granted. But I've, I guess, made it my mission to be the best version of myself I can be. Going to the last consecutive 5 Paralympic Games in my sport of swimming has taught me the value of mindset and setting goals, and having, I guess, a group of people around you that are able to lift you higher than you think you are. For me, I guess, being born with a disability wasn't easy. I struggled to do the normal things, such as put toothpaste on a toothbrush, or unscrew a lid of honey or jam, and walking upstairs isn't easy. But for me, I guess it's really been about making the most of what you have and not seeing what you don't have. It's been really about seeing and looking at what you can do to the best of your ability. For me, I guess, whether I'm standing on the blocks representing my country, or doing something at work or in my personal life, it's really about having that mindset of really wanting to do the best you can with what you've got, and really giving yourself 100% chance to be the best version of yourself you can be. Because I think the mindset and the resilience is all up to the attitude you bring to that activity, no matter what it is in life. And it's really been through, I guess, my sport, and through, I guess, having a lived disability, that I've been able to, I guess, achieve these things and have, I guess, that insight. Because not knowing, if you don't know, you don't know. It's really about, I guess, experiencing those things to really kind of understand what it really means and how it really affects you in certain ways. And for me, I guess, on this day of human rights, on this Human Rights Day, 10th of December, it is really pivotal to really see everyone for who they are, not for what they are, and really show the world what you're capable of, and really have those conversations with those people around you to really make it all the more inclusive and universal worldwide, not just on today, but every other day as well.
I would firstly like to express my appreciation to Philippa McDermott from Botany Bay for a heartwarming welcome to country, and I would also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Greetings, friends. On behalf of the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales, it is indeed my privilege to sincerely thank the many inspiring voices that have come together in solidarity this Human Rights Day to create awareness and drive dialogue about human rights, making them relevant to each of us and vital for all of us, we the peoples, to participate in building a world that is more equal, more just and inclusive, one where human rights are respected. And as mentioned today, of importance is raising awareness about that landmark document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As Australian, Dr. Herbert V. Evatt, the Doc, as he was affectionately called, President of the UN General Assembly from 1948 to 49, and who helped to draft the declaration, said, "The document will remain a dead letter if the people are unfamiliar with it, are uninterested in it, but it can become effective if the people stand behind it and insist that the principles in it are observed by themselves and all others." Furthermore, in an effort to embrace our common humanity and in recognition that all humans are the same in their basic requirements and desire to avoid suffering, today highlighted a need to take action and think collectively about how to assist the underprivileged get a fair go. And this requires urgent attention for many reasons, including that the COVID-19 pandemic has been accompanied by a surge in stigma, discrimination and hatred, which could be said has unjustly cost more lives instead of saving them. Concerningly, our world is becoming more fragmented, yet paradoxically, our fates are becoming more entwined. And so, real reform and the realisation of human rights starts at the basic level, from where it can ripple out, not just materially, but by measures of newfound hope, confidence and freedom, and to transfer our world, this unstable one, into one that is more democratic and non-discriminatory. As discussed today, it can happen through the power of sport, which is a basic right and is a notable vehicle to strengthen social ties and promote humanity. The practice of goodwill, working together and in partnership, can all ultimately contribute to building a more resilient and harmonious world environment where human rights are practiced, and a world where people, regardless of race, colour, religion, gender, status, are educated about their rights and encouraged to stand up to participate in decision making that affects the way they live, and ultimately in helping build a safer, fairer and more sustainable world for all, in the wonderful spirit of humanitarian mateship, the embodiment of human rights. I would now like to thank our partners who have supported us to deliver this amazing event, if I may say so that myself, including Affinity Intercultural Foundation and Executive Director Amit Pollitt, UTS Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, the Honourable Verity Firth, and the generosity of GHD Foundation. We need to have supporters and partners to achieve our aims and cannot do this alone. I would also proudly like to thank the dedicated UNAA New South Wales Human Rights Pillar team, led by Ms. Sahara Sumner, and the enthusiastic volunteers for their commitment and passion. Each and every one of the team is an outstanding example of genuine commitment to human rights at this moment in time and for the next generation. There are also many others who have worked behind the scenes technically and in many other ways and given generously of their time to help make this event happen. Thank you so much. Today, we are laying the foundations for this event to become an annual one, hopefully in person in 2022, and we invite you to lock it into your diary every year. As made evident today, there is still a lot more work to be done. This is also our decade of action, and you are invited to reach out to any of the organisations that you have heard from today to participate in human rights activism. Thank you, and please stay safe. See you next year.